Hi there, and welcome to another BigLipz podcast. My name is Sam Macaulay Blair, which it may say on the screen, it may not, because Zoom has clearly updated its software. And as ever, I am joined by the wonderful Catherine Maurice. The two of us are former and current film students, and we gather every other week to discuss our favourite medium. Obviously, we had a first season where we talked about movies, and now we're on to our second, where we're talking about television shows. If this is your first time joining us, basically the way we do it is every month we alternate who hosts, and every 2 weeks we alternate between a content and a concept episode. Last time we had Catherine's wonderful conceptual episodes, which was on musical numbers, and this time we're on a content episode, which I have picked, and that is the absolute fever dream of a show that is FX's Legion, which is technically a Marvel property. So, to kick off, Catherine, I wanted to ask, what is your opinion on Marvel? I know that you've mentioned this before, but I figured it makes sense to give us like a breakdown before we get into talking about Legion.
Yeah, no worries. But yeah, basically, as you've said, I've discussed it previously, that Marvel properties generally aren't my favourite type of TV show or movie. Um, I I don't know whether I'm not the audience for it. I've never really read comic books or that other than like the Beano. Do you know what I mean?
Right, Beano's Peak.
So exactly, yeah, exactly. The Beano and the Dandy ruined it for me. Everything other than that. um,
Quite right.
yeah, I feel like it's not. I personally don't. I find them really like cringy. I don't think they're cool. I'm not massive into like super action movies, like maybe the way that Marvel is, where it's like so action packed and there's things exploding and there's little scenes
Mm,
of slow mo. And I'm just it's not. It's generally not what I would choose to watch. It's not. It's just not my fave. And Marvel is very
yeah.
heavy on that at times. I also think it suffered from like the never-ending stream of
Yeah.
Marvel properties coming out just now, and then obviously you've got all the movies, and there's like all the different ways to watch them. Do you watch them in a release order or in kind of timeline order? And then when you go onto some streaming sites, it's got like phase one, phase two. So there's like 16 different ways that you can watch all the movies, and then they're continually bringing out these TV shows. And so I feel like that's definitely like, in my opinion, or for me anyway, like hindered it almost. Where
Yeah.
we've spoken about this before, where there's so much that if you've not been in it from the beginning, you're kind of left out. And I think as well we've kind of spoken briefly before, especially with the newer shows and movies and things. They're so connected to the ones previously that they're not really like a standalone thing. You tend to not be able to go in and just watch one movie because it'll hark back to or have characters from different movies, and if you're not familiar with everything, you don't really know who they are. It
Mm.
feels very like, yeah. So all in
Yeah.
all, not my favorite.
No, I think that's very fair. Yeah, and you said we have spoken about this before, but I think it is worth like touching on again. The fact that, and it's weird. I'm kind of like in two minds about this. But I think overall I like the fact that it is what it is. Marvel, because
Mm-hmm.
like, I kind of am on board with it. I definitely am at the point where like I'm getting pretty fatigued by it. Like my interest for
Yeah.
like the films, like I will be honest, I'm quite buzzing about the new Thor movie, but that is Taika Waititi. And I thought
Yeah.
Thor Ragnarok was excellent, but again, that was Taika Waititi, and I thought Jojo Rabbit was probably is my favorite of his films. So as far as I'm concerned, he's on a high. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
like very interested in seeing what he does next. I feel like he's kind of found it's almost like he's figured Thor out. The first like couple Thor movies were very different from like the third one. The character's quite different, and I feel like they've now sort of figured the character out. So it kind of feels like Thor's just coming into his stride. So I'm excited for the new Thor movie. I was excited for Doctor Strange, because again that was Sam Raimi, and there was like promised
Mm-hmm.
sort of horror moments and stuff. And I liked, I really liked the horror aspects of Doctor Strange, but I thought overall, I definitely felt like I would have enjoyed that movie a lot more had it come out, years ago rather than now, where a lot
Yeah.
of the movie I was like, it's hard to get excited by and interested in just because again, it's characters that we've seen a lot over the last few years, And again, there is like
because they churn them out so quickly.
Yeah.
It seems anyway. Like they're just constantly if it's not a Thor movie, it's Doctor Strange, or if it's not that, it's another Avengers movie. It's endless.
Yeah, and it's impressive, I would say, like the fact that I had to be careful that we're just turning this into a Marvel podcast. It is impressive, I think, how much of like a film empire or a media empire they've built and how quickly they've done it, because it's only been around for 14 years and there's now like probably more films than any other franchise ever, and it's obviously it's a new thing. Like it's they've figured out how to sort of turn comic book properties in the way that comic books work into a movie. And I'm not someone who's ever really read comic books. Kind of tried to a couple times, especially like in the MCU's younger days. I tried to buy like a couple of comics and give them a go, but I just don't really. It's weird. I find it really hard to get into comics. I almost feel like there's kind of too little substance to them. And yeah,
that's the writer in you.
Yeah, and I just feel like it's almost like a frustrating in between where I would rather read a book or watch a film, not have this sort of like like semi like there's pictures and it's trying to like provoke thoughts of action and stuff, and then there's also like dialogue, and it just doesn't really work for me. Anyway, so I have a lot of respect for it, and the fact that like it is now at the point where, because they've made so much money, they are kind of like, do you know what, we are just going to kind of assume that you've seen these movies and shows and you are caught up to date. Like, you know, they know that there's going to be people who are a bit lost, but they're actually at the point where they're kind of like, we don't really care. And I kind of appreciate the fact that we've got that. Like, you know, generally I think there's a lot of sequels and franchise films that are hurt by, you know, the need they feel to try and like catch every single possible viewer up on everything that's happened. Sometimes you just get like, there's so much exposition before you can even get into like the exposition of the film you're watching. Like they have to give you like several movies worth of background, whereas I quite like the MCU is now just kind of like, nah, people either know or, you know what, they're in the audience and don't really care. Their friends have probably, you know, you can go on YouTube and watch like catch up things, but it is at the same time like, you know, I watched Moon Knight before Doctor Strange came out because I was like, well, I don't want there to be like references between each that I'm kind of lost out on, and there wasn't. But you know, I didn't really care about watching Moon Knight, and I'm kind of like that with most of the Marvel shows. Like, I'm kind of watching them not because I'm like, oh my god, Miss Marvel, I can't wait for that TV show. I'm kind of watching it because I'm like, well, I'm so like so like in the MCU now that I'm like, well, I might as well just watch this 6-episode show rather than like
like it's almost force of habit for you now.
Exactly. Kind of like begrudgingly watching them. Sometimes you get like, you know, WandaVision I thought started out really good and really original, but it kind of then descended into MCU Trek. Anyway, I've gone way too much of a rant about that. Basically, I'm on the other side of the fence with you, but I definitely see, I think all your criticisms are valid, and I wouldn't be like, you know, you have to watch all of these Marvel things right now. And that's why, you know, I picked this show because it feels very un-MCU. So again, like I guess kind of building off of the last point, what were your expectations for the show going
in? So basically, in all honesty, I hadn't even, like I had no kind of previous like dealings with it at all. I hadn't really heard of it, or if I had heard of it, it's obviously just skimmed right over my head. I remember you must have spoken about it when we first kind of met, because I found it odd that you were talking about Dan Stevens, and the only thing I had seen him in was Downton Abbey. And I was like, how do you know who he is? Are you a secret Downton watcher? Like... and then it honestly wasn't until I was watching it and I was like, that'll be how Sam knows.
Well, I also a huge fan of his work in Beauty and the Beast.
I mean, yes, very true. How could we forget? But yeah, as I say, I had absolutely no idea what to expect. And then I think because I knew it was Marvel, I had kind of like that little bit of, oh God, I don't know what this is going to be like. But saying that, I had no idea what any of the plot was, other than I knew that Dan Stevens was in it. That was it. I didn't know any of their cast, any of the characters or anything like that. So I genuinely went in like completely blind. Did you start watching it when it first came out, or is it something you caught up on?
So when I was living with this guy who I'd studied with in Glasgow, studied filming with, studied in Glasgow Uni with him. We both did film. That's how I met him. Ended up living with him, and I think it was on his radar, it wasn't on mine. He, I think, was quite into, again, he's quite into, like, MCU, probably, like, to about the same degree as me overall, but at that point, I think he was kind of following, you know, like, comic book property news more than I was. I know that he was big into Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. I watched that a little bit and then kind of fell away from it. So I think it came on his radar, and it was weird because this was, like, kind of pre-MCU. I mean, MCU only really properly started doing TV shows the last couple of years. Like, WandaVision was the first one. Before that, there was, like, the Netflix ones, and this predates. No, does it predate? No, I think the Netflix had theirs. I didn't even really watch the Netflix ones, Daredevil and that. I think the Netflix had their, like, MCU shows, but this was connected to X-Men. So I think there was, like, questions about, like, how what it would connect to, if it would connect to anything, if it was just going to be its own thing. I hadn't even really heard of, like, the character of Legion. I had no idea, like, who he really was. And again, I remember my flatmate kind of just talking about the show coming out. So him saying it looked really good, looked really weird, looked really sort of stylized. Again, as, like, a film student, there was, like, a lot from what he'd seen of it and was hearing about it. I think he was definitely really liking the look of it. And I remember the first episode came out. I think he, like, downloaded it, and cause I think it was, like, impossible to find. I don't think it came out in the UK for a bit. And we watched the first episode together, and I remember just thinking, I was like, that was just an absolute trip.
Yeah.
And I was very on board with it. I was like, you know, this is very, very different. But yeah, going into it, like, he probably, like, braced me fairly well for what it was going to be. I probably got, like, a fair, like, rundown package from him going in. So I don't think, you know, I went into it thinking, oh, this is going to be, like, a Marvel movie, and then was, like, totally blindsided by it. But it still, you know, it's still something that, even though I was prepared for it to be weird, it still is very weird.
Yes.
Going into something thinking it's going to be weird doesn't necessarily actually prepare you for the weirdness. Like, I'm going to see the movie, I think it's Men, it's called, the Alex Garland film. I'm going to see that later today. And I think from what I've seen of it, it seems like it's going to be a weird movie. But I still expect that I'm going to sit there.
Yeah, Alex Garland movies tend to be weird, and even the one that he writes as well are very like almost grounded in reality, but they're just weird.
Yeah, and I feel like he's pushing it further and further. So I'm very interested in seeing it, but yeah, I think I'm still going to sit there, and there's going to be multiple points where I'm like, okay, this is weird.
Yeah.
But it's nice to get that. So yeah, obviously we sort of laid out the expectations. What were your thoughts, I guess?
So
generally?
The short version is, I wasn't a fan. I'm not gonna lie. I didn't like it.
Fair.
And I feel like the way that I would describe it, you've obviously touched on it slightly, is it was like an assault on the senses. Like, it was constant.
Yeah.
And I found it really, really funny. Like, one of the days I watched it and had a slight headache, and then the following day I woke up and had a migraine. So, you know, there was a lot going on.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's fair.
And
that's fair.
I feel like I do appreciate what they were doing, what they were trying to do, but there was a lot going on.
Yeah.
Like, and I feel like the episodes were quite long. They kind of tended to be between 45 minutes to an hour long, and it felt like a constant. Like, it wasn't even just like the plot was very all over the place. For reasons that kind of came together. But that was another slight issue I had, that nothing came together until maybe like episode 7, which was the second last one. So by that point, you've watched 6+ hours of absolute utter confusion. And like, I felt like it was very difficult, obviously purposely, to follow to the point where it wasn't even, because, you know, when you watch mysteries and things like that, it's quite fun to try and play along and figure out what's happening. This was so out there that you couldn't, like, you just had to like ride out.
Yeah.
Which I think kind of took away from it for me. I like the kind of, I think I've spoken about it before in the podcast, I like kind of like shows and movies that are almost immersive, that you can get involved in and try and figure out what's happening and things, where I feel like this was very much like, look what we've done, look how cool this is. And it did look very cool, but it was a lot. I feel that is definitely how I would describe it.
I think to sum it down to a phrase, a lot is definitely the show.
Yeah, 100%. I feel like as well, because I didn't, like I said, I didn't really know anything about it, but I had kind of sussed out when they were talking about mutants and stuff, it must be something vaguely related to X-Men. But I feel like because of the like even just like the basic story, because it was mutants, they could do whatever they wanted.
Yeah.
Which made it even harder to try and understand what was happening, because there was no basis in here's how things work. Do you know what I mean? Even if you've seen the X-Men movies, which I have, and I do enjoy the X-Men movies, I'm not gonna lie.
Fair.
Even having seen them, it's so like standalone, like you were saying, that it seems like everything's happening and there's no explanation or justification for these things happening, and it was just a lot.
Again, very fair. I think it's such a fascinating one for me, because, and I remember having this conversation after the first series, because I think I watched the first half of the first series before I went to Canada. So I watched that with my flatmate, and then because it was coming out obviously week to week, and then I think I watched I watched the first half again, and then the end of it with my then girlfriend who I was in Canada with. And I think she was quite similar to you, where she was very much like, that wasn't for me. And I remember like the two of us discussing it a lot. But it's interesting because like there's so much about the show that I feel like on paper shouldn't work with me. Again, like I generally like things to have like, you know, quite a tight structure. I like, you know, I like it when there's like, you know, a well sort of like told story. It's well sort of paced. It builds well. There's obviously like things set up and paid off. And again, like you say, there's a sort of you want to be able to like guess and figure out where things are going, and you know you want to be surprised, but you want to feel like the show is like guiding you down a path, and then you know either like subverting your expectations or kind of meeting them, but like delivering them on them. And like you say, this show kind of doesn't really do that. It just is its own thing, and it's like how many left turns can a show possibly take? However many you think it is, you're like it's more.
100%.
And it's like that all the way through, and I think like even by the end, like I think it ties things together quite nicely, but at the same time there's definitely like throughout the whole like 3-season run, there's definitely stuff that you know when you look back you're like, why did that happen? That was never really explained, that was never really paid off, or but I think a lot of like what it's doing is like, you know, things happen and the point isn't what it's building up to or what the questions it's raising. Sometimes it's just like what is the actual thing happening is kind of the point. And again, it's weird, like that should really bother me. Like I should have been a lot more like unfulfilled, but I think for some reason there's something about the show, and I guess all art kind of is subjective, but there's something about the specific weirdness of this show that just completely clicked with me. And again, it's a really weird one, because like I know multiple people that have watched it, and it does seem to be very polarizing in the fact that there's some people that were just like, yeah, that was not for me at all, but then other people like my mum, I was very surprised at the fact, you know, I recommended it to her for ages, because again, like I feel like you can't really predict how someone is going to take the show. There's no way to be like, oh well, you like this type of thing, so here's something similar.
There's I can't think of a single thing out there that I'd be like, oh yeah, that sounds like it's similar to leaking.
Yeah, I've never watched anything and been like, oh yeah, okay, like yeah, getting like it's more because I watched the first season of it when it came out. I think I started watching the second season when it was coming out, and then kind of fell away. I think it was when I just moved to Manchester, and I think I only had like an iPad, and I don't think it was really possible to watch it in the UK at that point, so it was just like way too difficult. So I ended up like sitting on it, and it wasn't until we started at uni together that I went back and finished the second season, and then the third season was just coming out then, so watched that one. and I remember we were doing German expressionism, and suddenly noticing like a lot of that in Legion, and that was just another thing. Like for me, I was like, okay, I really appreciate the fact that they've like, you know, that there's all these like stylistic. You can tell there's like a lot of. That's the thing I think that's really weird about it is, it feels so scattershot. It feels so all over the place. But like at the same time, you can tell that the people making it, they're like, no, we know exactly what we're doing, which is really, really bizarre.
Yeah, 100%. I feel like there was times where I was watching it and I was like, you could tell that the people making it were like very into film and TV and things like that. Because it felt there were times where it felt almost like a very ambitious student film.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like when you're almost like trying to be so out of the box that's kind of what it was giving me vibes of.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of like art house cinema where you're watching something and it's more like an emotive experience than it is actually like, you know, again, it's the plot. There is a plot, and it's almost like weird because there is like, again, because it comes from like a comic book property, there is actually this really like dense sort of lore and mythology around it. And you can kind of feel that, but it is weird because it almost doesn't really care about that. Like it uses that to build its story, but it's almost kind of like, I don't really think about that. Like know that we have this stuff figured out and you can dig into the stuff if you want, but don't really think about it because again, it's more about the weirdness of it. So I guess going for like moving on to the next point, the main character, obviously we talked about Dan Stevens. And if you're looking for another thing that I know Dan Stevens from, which I think actually predates Legion, is a movie called The Guest, which he's also terrific, and it's just like a little indie film basically, which I've only seen it the one time. Really good soundtrack, and again from my memory of it, it's one of those films that I think the plot was like quite basic. It's one of those things that you're like, if this had been made by a different filmmaker, would have just been really generic and dull. But there's a really nice like sort of style to it, and Dan Stevens is terrific in it. So I know him from two things. But yeah, the main character of David. What were your thoughts on him?
He was a really like a difficult character. Is that how you would describe it? And I think that works really well for the story, obviously, because the whole point is that he's like got all these powers and things, but he's got the parasite. So there's not just David, there's like multiple, I don't want to say personalities, but there's multiple like people in there, do you know what I mean? And I feel like Dan Stevens does a really good job of that, because there's times when he's really like likable and sympathetic and things like that, and then there's times where you're like, God, he's getting right on my last nerve.
Yeah.
thing. And then I think it's funny, I feel like he was more likable kind of in the beginning when he thought he was schizophrenic, which was bizarre. But I think that was because he was a bit more like placid, and it felt maybe a bit more relatable because he was also clueless. He had no idea what was going on. He was just kind of getting dragged around the way that we were almost. I think he's a really interesting character because, like I was saying, you don't know what of him is David and what of him is the kind of the Shadow King, I think they call him. So like, but they've been together for so long that you don't, it's like, does David even know who David is?
Yeah.
And there's one of the episodes where he's chatting to Lenny and he's saying like, who am I without you? Because we've been together for so long, since birth. I think he's like 30 or something in the show. So yeah, he's a really difficult character. I think there's definitely times where I was like, God, David, I really don't like you. You're getting on my last nerve. And he does that thing where at times he's so like willful, like, I know how to do this. And I think it's infuriating at the time because he's obviously at that kind of sanctuary place and they're trying to teach him. And it's, I don't know, it's such a really weird one actually, because he's so kind of like misguided the whole way through as well. Like he doesn't know what's going on. Yeah. So, but no, I think in conclusion of my rambling point, what I'm trying to say is that I think Dan Stevens does a really good job because there's so many elephants.
Elephants.
Elements. There's so many elements that David doesn't just kind of come across as a single character. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, fair. Before I go on with, because there's some stuff I want to touch on. Do you? I'm guessing you won't, but I'll ask. Do you care about spoilers for the rest of the show?
No, I was actually going to ask you because I felt like that would be easier.
Yeah.
Than watching the other seasons.
Yeah. No, that's fair. Because so one of the things that I really like about the show overall is the fact that, and I didn't, again, it for me was what separated it from other comic book properties, is they basically take all the stuff you're sort of touching on. That's kind of the point of it all. That's the whole thing is basically David's story, but the further along it goes, the more it becomes okay. How what is he? What how much of him is him, and how much of him was influenced by the Shadow King, as you said. The sort of the villain of it, Amal Farouk, and the thing that I really liked is because I can't remember. I think in the first season they tell you obviously that because he realizes he's I'm not insane. I have powers. And I can't remember if it's in the first season. I think it's in the second season. Or maybe even the third. There's the realization that no, he is also insane and has powers. It is both. Which I quite liked. And they take it further where they basically turn him into a villain. I was kind of getting those vibes. I've written in my notes that he's kind of hero turned villain turned hero turned villain again, kind of And it's done really well. I feel because again, the Shadow King is kind of the main villain, the main antagonist. And season 2 very much builds up to this confrontation between David and the Shadow King. And then that that's basically the start of the last episode of the second season. And then, which you would kind of assume is going to be the payoff of the show, but then what the show does, which again I thought was really good, was it basically says no, that's not really the point. That's what most of these shows would build up to, and that would kind of be all you get. But really, what ends up happening is in order to catch the Shadow King or in order to beat him, he does some dodgy stuff, and it kind of the show really calls him out on it. And the relationship with him and Sid becomes a really major part of it, because she sort of disagrees with him, and then he wipes her memory, and then it takes that really serious because she goes into the whole, because she finds out and she's she because he basically does that to sustain their relationship, and she's
that's gaslighting to a whole other level.
Exactly. Well, yeah, exactly. She's that's a horrendous thing to do to someone. You literally brainwashed me so that I would stay in love with you, and then as a result in the third season he's kind of not on the back burner, but he's not front and center, the protagonist. He is more, you're more following all the other characters as they're kind of trying to hunt him down and stop him. And yeah, again, I appreciated the fact that it basically makes you follow this character. And then in the end of the second series, they're no, there was a lot of red flags along the way. And he finds a lot of excuses for his actions, but again, the show calls that out. And I think again, the fact that it's so hard, it's so all over the place. It does do a good job of you're not really paying as much attention as you would be to a normal show. So when it suddenly takes these things seriously, you really don't expect it. On a very, very different note, because again, jumping from one point discordantly to the next, as the show kind of does. One element I liked, but again really threw me the first time, were the sort of musical numbers that happen throughout. Do you think they added anything to it? Do you think they detracted from it? What were your thoughts on them?
I think they definitely added to the weirdness. That's for sure. I think though because I think there was maybe 3 or 4 in the first season. The first one being quite a big dance number, in the hospital. I remember that was kind of the point where it was solidified, where I was yep, I don't know what's going on in this show. I think it added to what they were trying to build, this kind of weirdness. But yeah, I feel like it was just in any other show, it would have been, it probably would have ruined it. Like, that's it, I'm not going to watch it anymore. But in that show, you just kind of went with it. Like, okay, they're singing. And then there was there was another bit where it was like the character of Lenny, and it was like almost, she wasn't singing, but it was like a dance number.
Yeah.
I feel like that looked really, really good.
Yeah.
Because it was kind of like just like silhouettes and stuff like that. So I thought that looked really cool. And it was almost like a nice, almost point of like relaxation, like, oh, here, just enjoy this for a wee minute. Like, you don't need to think about what's happening.
An interlude from like the assault.
Yeah, 100%. I was like, honestly, they came and I was like, oh, thank God.
Fair enough.
Did you enjoy them? Because I know we were talking about last episode, musicals aren't really your thing.
Again, yeah, like you say, I think I enjoyed them because of the fact that it adds to the complete like lunacy of the show, and I think it does a really good job of, because there's also something, generally I think musical numbers are like, they are very like sort of campy and upbeat in tone.
Yeah.
And I feel like, again, there's something very much with the whole first season of the show in particular, there's always sort of something sinister underneath. And even with the musical numbers, you get that. There's something like off about them where you're like, they are kind of like campy and silly like musical numbers are. But I think, a combination of like the lighting and the sort of music and even just the way that there's like it's edited and stuff, always just kind of feel like there's just something sinister bubbling below. I think like in the first episode there's that musical number. In the background there's just like a guy in a tree or something like that. But it's just little things like that there's just no reason for that to be there, and the show doesn't really call attention to it, but it's just a little bit off-putting. And that's what I kind of liked about it, because it does very much feel like, to me, a sort of personification of like David's mental state of, he doesn't really know what's going on. His head is all over the place. Nothing really makes sense. But it does, I think, because I think the first sort of musical number is to do with like his feelings for Sid, and again, it's all about like, it's showing you, again, it's an emotive sort of experience. But again, it's one of those things where we're kind of either there. Do you know what? It's very like a Charlie Kaufman film.
Yes, which is very funny because I'm really not a fan of them.
I'm really not a fan of them either. Like I said, on paper, I shouldn't like this show, and I really do. And it's one of those things that I feel like you just don't know where you're gonna like. You could end up loving it, you could end up hating it, and it probably will be one of those. I feel like it'd be really difficult to just be like ambivalent on this one.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's just such a good show to discuss. And obviously it works that we've got differing opinions on it, because it's weird, like, obviously our opinions are very different, but you're making such good points about like why the musical numbers and things are in there. So very interesting discussion.
Thank you. Cool. Moving on. So obviously we've discussed David, the protagonist. What were your thoughts on some of the other characters, some of the side characters or antagonists?
So one of the characters that I actually really liked was Oliver.
Jermaine Clement.
I think. What was that? Sorry.
Jermaine Clement.
Yes. I feel like he came in at a really good point. Like, he came in right as I was starting to get like almost a bit fed up with the show, and he came in and he just kind of like, he was very funny, like charismatic. His character was quite fun as well, in a way that maybe some of the other ones weren't. Which could have been the actor. But yeah, I feel like he was such like a good introduction as well. I thought his character as well was quite clever. Like, it's obviously Melanie's husband, but he's been missing for 20 years, and then like things like the coffee machine's his voice, and you can hear it, and you have kind of heard it throughout the show, but you don't obviously realise that it's him. So yeah, I thought he was quite funny. He was quite weird and like in a bit more fun of a way, where he was just seemed really like eccentric and weird.
Yeah.
So I think it was a really cool, for me anyway, for the kind of Shadow King to like start like possessing him or attach himself onto him, so that obviously guarantees a lot more screen time for Oliver. So yeah, he was definitely one of my favourites. I feel like though when he was introduced, Melanie, I feel was quite like one of the weaker characters. I feel like there was a lot more scope for her to to be in it a bit more and to be a bit
Yeah.
more like of an active part of it, but she wasn't. She felt very like a side character, like just a bit kind of bland and nothing. And even her relationship with Oliver was very like, she was just kind of quietly like, oh, do you remember that I'm your wife? And he was like, no. Moving on. So yeah, I feel like Melanie was a kind of a weird character. She didn't really do much,
Yeah.
in my opinion. Even though it was kind of presented that she was like the head honcho at the kind of sanctuary place. The other character I thought could have been used a lot more and a lot better was, I did try and look up the guy's name, but I couldn't understand what it was saying. You know, the guy with the eye with the curly hair.
Yeah, I know exactly. The character's name's Walter, I think.
Is it Walter?
Yeah.
It had a weird name on it. Anyway.
Fair enough.
I feel like he was very underused. He could have been a lot more... Like, obviously you've got the main villain. And then you had the kind of Division 3 guy who...
Yeah. Clark,
yeah, who was like horribly burned and stuff. I feel like this guy, Walter, he could have been a lot more of a kind of like side villain, where and then it kind of, you've got more at stake because you're not just fighting the one villain that's basically inside David's head.
Yeah.
He could have been a lot more of like a physical threat, and he was at one point but he was just chasing one kind of minor character.
Yeah.
And he wasn't chasing her very well. It was pretty lame. So yeah, I feel like he was very underused. I can't even really remember what happened to him. I think he was killed during the whole like confrontation when he tried to shoot David, and that was like a 3-episode long debacle. So yeah, I feel like it's bad that I didn't even remember how he died. Like I didn't even really remember what happened to him. And then the last character I wanted to talk about was Lenny. I feel like definitely one of my favourite characters. I feel like I like the kind of obviously reveal that was like the Shadow King or whatever, and I think that's really interesting, like we were talking about, where it's who is David and what is he like. I think it's funny that he was friends with Lenny. So he'd obviously have, like we saw them multiple times having conversations and stuff. They had conversations about Sid and things like that. So that's him speaking to that kind of parasite monster. So he'll be feeding off that. He knows David probably more than like maybe David knows himself. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
And I think that was a really cool way having the character as kind of like a quirky, kind of like female friend character, where I feel like it was good. She was clearly a bad influence, but not in the way when you're watching TV shows or that, where you just get raging because it doesn't... They're a bad influence to the point where they're going to end up killing someone, or...
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, they're just a bad influence in that she's just a bad influence, do you know what I mean? I feel like... in
the juvenile sense of the word.
Yeah, like, I mean, pretty hardcore drugs and stuff like that,
yeah.
but you know, it could be worse. So yeah, she was definitely one of my favourites. I think other than that, one of my slight issues with the show is that there were maybe too many characters to the point where you couldn't... The other characters felt very much like side characters, like you can barely remember their name kind of character, in my opinion anyway.
Yeah, no, fair. No, I think all very thick, fair
sorry.
thoughts. That's fine. I think, like, again, I don't disagree with anything you're saying. And I think, for me, I'm pretty much on the same page where, like, Lenny, like, was an absolute standout for me. Apparently, obviously, because you know where they take the character in the first season and stuff, it turning out to be the Shadow King and everything. I remember reading, I think it was after the first episode came out, I was reading a review for it, and they talked about the fact that at that point, obviously, you don't really know what they're doing with the character. And I remember reading that apparently, like, they hadn't intended, they weren't looking for someone like Aubrey Plaza to cast in that role. They were looking for like a 50-year-old man to cast in that role. And I have no idea how she ended up like auditioning for it, but obviously she did.
I feel like she was a lot of the character, similar to Oliver, a lot of the character is in her performance.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I can't imagine the show with her not in it. And I think and the first season in particular adds so much to it. And was like, for me, I think again, like, I thought David was a really interesting protagonist in the sense that, you know, like, I think the show does a really good job of realizing his like sort of psychosis. And again, the first episode in particular, I remember really being blown away by. Like, I was like, this is all over the place. But again, I was there for it, because again, I was like, that's how he feels all the time. You know, he doesn't know what's going on, and I thought it did a really good job of making you go, okay, like, I get why he's sort of so erratic and confused by things, because like I am also confused by things, and the show is being really erratic. So I thought I did a really good job of like realizing his mental state, but at the same time, like, he is, you know, he has a he's very like protagonist in a lot of senses, in that he's learning how to sort of use his powers, and he has his sort of moral code that he tries to like abide by, and he's sort of learning about his bit, whereas Lenny is just kind of like out there to have fun, and she is just like this element of chaos. And I think every time like she's in the show gets better. So yeah, I'm very much with you there, and I think there are. I find it again. It's interesting when you watch the whole thing and the way that some of the characters, because some of the characters are like, you get a lot more done with them, and it being Legion, not what you expect. They get taken in like very strange ways. But I think one thing that I really liked about the first series is that I think the first series definitely suffers from having like a lot to set up. I think also probably conforms the most. I think it comes the closest to being a conventional TV show, even though it's really not. Like, I think what you talk about with like the Division and stuff, they almost are your typical like shady government organization, with like, you know, you almost like, they seem initially like you're sort of like carbon cut, like antagonistic foils, you know, men in suits, that sort of thing. And again, I think the show kind of breaks away from that. The further on it goes, it just leans more into like the absolute lunacy of it, and it goes to weird places. But I like the fact that it embraces that side more than, I like that it pushes, because I think it feels at its worst when it's almost like caught between being like a normal show and being like a really weird show, whereas when it's just like, okay, no, it is just a really weird show, like, improves. But yeah, I like the fact that, because they even kind of started to do a bit of that in the first series, where I think it's the finale of the first series, where it just opens and it just suddenly gives you like the backstory of like Clark. Who, like, I think he's only really in the first episodes at that point, so you almost like forget about the character, and then it's like the show's...
Honestly, he showed up at the end of episode 7, it must have been, and I was like, who's that again? And then I was like, oh,
like,
and then it delved into his background for like a while.
Yeah, no, I know, and it very much, because like I had exactly the same reaction, whereas you turned up and I was like, who? And then when the last episode opens and spends a lot of time, again, I remember that was one of the points where I was like, yeah, this show's very much for me, because I was just like, it's not a question anyone was really asking. And like you say, it's not a small amount of time that the show dedicates to it. It's like the last episode of it's the season finale, and it's just like, it just properly goes in on his backstory, and really,
and there's a lot of like footage of him. There's a lot of scenes where like him just in his house with his husband and his son, like just him sitting in bed doing nothing.
Yeah, and they don't even like hint at this in the first. I think that's the thing that's again to me so brilliant about it, is it's not even like he has like these little like remarks that allude to him having like a family or like more of a life. It just throws he is just like a carbon cutout villain, and then all of a sudden he's like a fully realized character. It's the strangest thing. But again, the show does a lot of that with characters, where like you almost forget about characters, and then out of nowhere it's like, no, like suddenly we're gonna give you like a lot of information on this character. So by the end of like the show, you have like a very different perspective on like a lot of like the show and the character than you do as you're going through it. But yeah, I think one thing that I think is really well done in the first series is just, to me, there's sort of a theme of like everyone's powers being like an absolute curse rather than, you know, a blessing.
Uh-huh.
Like everyone has like they're all problems. You know, obviously David's psychosis. You know, he's been like locked up for hearing voices. Which I think, you know, is the part he is, like I said, it does sort of explain that he is also you know, he is like mental, but at the same time he does have powers, and part of it is like misdiagnosis. Him hearing voices is partly like the Shadow King and partly like his telekinesis. And again, I just thought that was a really clever idea. The idea that he's, of course, like he actually can hear voices, but of course everyone would think he's insane. And then if you live a life where you're being told you are insane, you're not going to develop normally, and you are going to have like genuine issues, especially because, like, you know, he's hearing actual thoughts and he knows how people are viewing him and everything. And then obviously you have the character Sid, which I think is just a genius idea for like, you know, to get to have like a romance where they can't ever touch. And even the ways that they sort of develop that in the first series, where David obviously learns to sort of build like a place for them to go mentally, but then you have like Oliver, who, you know, you see the dangers of like astral projecting and leaving your body, and then you have like, what's it, Ptolemy, the one who you can like remember everything, and again he talks about like how sort of haunting that is, not ever being able to forget anything. Obviously you have Kerry and Carrie, and the two of them share their body, and again it's just, there's always, everyone's powers are like a problem, rather than it being this show about how everyone has these powers and they're great and they're having like the time of their life. And that to me was like just one thing I thought the show, again, it helped to separate it from like your standard show. But yeah, I do agree
that's such a good point.
Thank you. But yeah, I do agree that at the same time, like, the show doesn't, especially in the first season, doesn't spend a lot of time really giving you that much on the characters. And again, like, it will pretty much just like forget about characters for a while.
I think it's odd as well, because they do spend a lot of time with certain characters, but they still remain like almost like distant side characters. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
they're
like kind of like, there's like kind of like main crew, and really the only people that you get any kind of history is Sid, kind of, and David, and that's it.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, exactly. And it is very strange to get so little on characters that you see a lot of, you just don't actually like learn that much about. So moving on a little bit, another thing I wanted to talk about was the sort of genre of the show. Obviously it is like a comic book property, but I thought, again, one of the things I thought was really interesting about it is it does sort of weave different genres. Obviously we talked about having musical segments. What did how did you find its approach to genre? Were there any moments where it maybe like leaned into a genre you like more or less? Again, obviously we talked about musical numbers and stuff. Were there points, you talked about that being nice because it was like a respite, but were there other points where it would maybe lean into another genre and you'd be like, oh, for God's sake? I'll stop rambling and let you actually speak.
I think there was definitely elements, and it was funny when I did a very brief Google before, like just trying to find out what it was. It was like suggestions were coming up, like, is Legion a horror show? And definitely not, is what I would say.
Yeah.
But I think there are definitely like horror type elements, and more than just because I would argue points in most TV shows that can be scary and things like that, but this definitely had like horror elements and like feelings of horror in there. But I think similar to the kind of musical number, I think that was like sporadic enough that it didn't completely take away from I feel like it was just the perfect amount. I feel like any more it would have been a very different show. Which I think would have taken away, it would have been more about the horror elements and how scary the different elements were, like Farouk and stuff like that, how scary that was. That would have taken away from David, like you were saying, like the whole point is his story. But I think they were really a nice addition, because if you were David, there would be points where it would be very scary.
Yeah. Like,
he's seeing all these different things, he's hearing all these voices and things like that. He doesn't have a clue what's going on. So I think it makes sense for them to be horror elements in there. I think they were quite good. I don't think they were like cheap, gimmicky, like overly full of jump scares, things like that, which is such an easy way to include horror. I think this definitely had more feelings of horror than horror tropes, maybe.
Yeah.
I would argue. So that was one of the elements that I did like. I think with things that were very recognisable for a particular genre was something like I was saying about musical segments, something to like latch onto, something that you recognised. Do you know what I mean? Like an anchor point almost. Yeah. So I think I did enjoy those elements of it. I think it's really interesting, and would have been really interesting to write, to get different different genres in there, because generally if you're writing you tend to mainly stick to one.
Yeah.
Or you've got like your kind of main one, and then there's like, so you could do like dark comedy and things like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think though generally it did have that kind of comic book element to it. That kind of like superhero-y type thing to it. Yeah. I think that was definitely underlined. That was kind of like their main, I wouldn't even say that was their main genre. I think they're just, do you know what I mean? Like, how could you even describe it? One thing I did want to add though was there were points, I don't know anything about the budget or anything like that, but there were points that felt quite amateurish.
Yeah.
To me.
What points in particular?
So one point was when they were kind of fighting to get Farouk out of David, and Lenny appeared and she looked awful, and she was obviously like, she looked kind of like half dead type thing, and her hair was all messed up. I felt like her makeup just looked like a student production. Like, you know, that way it was like a very like white kind of face paint that she had on, and just like running blood and things like that, and her hair was all messed up. It just looked so, I feel like it's a weird, because it was a weird show. They had obviously like a pretty big cast. They had pretty like large and nice set pieces, do you know what I mean? Like, and then for them to have points of like terrible CGI, like when you first meet Oliver in the kind of astral plane bit, when he's just in his diving suit in the woods, it looked awful in my opinion.
No, fair.
And I feel like it was really like jarring because of the other elements that were so like aesthetically pleasing, do you know what I mean? Like a lot of the sets and locations and stuff like that looked amazing, and then you had this terrible CGI. It was weird. I think, I don't know whether it was on purpose to add to how jarring it was, like, or was that just a happy coincidence?
I actually don't know. Again, there's a lot of like, I don't know the intention behind a lot of the things with Legion. And I think I've talked to you about this before. Like, one thing that really annoys me is there's not like a proper physical release of like the whole thing. So there's not like loads of like special features and stuff to sort of delve into. I think there was in the first season. It's a weird one because like I think the first season did like relatively well. And it was obviously there was a lot of promotion behind it, and I think it did okay numbers, and then it got greenlit for like a second season, which was I think maybe like double the length of episodes, and I actually do think that's to season 2's disadvantage. I think season 2 does go on a bit long, and again I think season 2, like, I love the whole show, but I think there are, it definitely sags the most. But I think what happened with season 2 is it feels like season 1 definitely had, like, I don't know, there's definitely points throughout it where you're very aware that the show has a budget, and I think because I have a feeling that they might have actually still been in production of season 2 as season 2 was coming out, and I think there was a huge drop off in numbers, so I think they had like less money towards the end of it. I feel like the budget for season 2 was maybe higher, but a lot of that just went into doing more episodes, rather than, and I could be wrong, I could be completely like off about this stuff, but it felt like that to me, rather than actually like each episode feeling higher produced. Actually, it probably feels like the first season probably feels the highest in terms of like production value and budget, because again there's a lot of like lavish sort of sets and even like costuming work and stuff. But at the same time, yeah, there's moments like there's like dodgy CGI, and I do feel like that very much is what the show is kind of going for. I think season 3 for me was the one that nailed it the most in terms of like realization versus like actual means. Because I think even obviously I mentioned like David and the Shadow King facing off at the end of season 2, and that is something which, again, like I love the way that they did it. But it's very stylized, and you can tell like the whole sort of thing screams that this was done on a budget, but it very much leans into that, and that's kind of like, again, it's just that's the show, and by that point you're like, you're most of the way through it, so you kind of like you have either accepted it or you like it's not the show for you,
or you've dropped off.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, for me it's one of those things that I think kind of adds to it. But at the same time, like I very much get what you mean, and I can totally see how it can. I remember one thing I remember like being obviously told in first year, where we studied, was like when you're filming something, overall you should always try and make the quality match. Like if you have like one thing that was like one like scene or one shot that's like poorly filmed, or was like lower resolution or low quality or whatever, you should basically lower the rest of it all to match that, because otherwise
because it's so jarring.
Yeah, exactly. All it takes is like that one thing to kind of like break the immersion of the whole piece otherwise. And I think with CGI in particular, like movies and shows really do suffer from duff CGI can totally kill something, because it does just remind you that you're watching a show. But I think Legion constantly reminds you that you're watching a show. I think it's very hard to not, you don't think you're in that world. But yeah, the horror stuff for me, I really, really liked. Unsurprisingly, we talked at length about how our affinity for horror. And I think again for me the thing that I liked was it wasn't so much about like I wasn't like, I was watching the whole thing in the dark and I was terrified. But for me there was just like a sort of permeating like atmosphere that I thought the show did a really good job of capturing. And this might have just been like a thing that I got more than anything else, but I just thought it did a really good job of, again, it's almost like the sort of Jaws and Alien thing of the Shadow King a lot of the time is this sort of like implied threat, and even like the first episode I think you see him a good few times, he's just in the background of shots, and he's not really called attention to, and there's a lot of that where it's like there's just something off, and that's what it's sort of like for
unsettling.
David. Yeah, that, and like the whole thing of him being this parasite that's just lived on David his whole life, and even being called the Shadow King. I think it's far more effective. It does a really good job of being like, no, there is this like evil thing that is just always there in his head, always sort of around his existence, and it is always sort of lurking there. And even like the whole thing of like, David can't really trust his own memories, his own like perceptions of things. All of that stuff I thought was just, it all does a really good job of building, and even uses like iconography. Obviously the institution that he's in the first episode is called Clockworks. I think there is just that it does a really good job of like drawing in pop culture to reinforce sort of creepy elements, and just constantly scream at you that like things are off. And I think the unpredictability of the show for me just made me appreciate the horror more, because there's nothing worse than horror. And that every character's safe, that there's not really like the horror, the scares are kind of just a bit cheap. Again, like I really like the show Buffy, and obviously there's like strong horror elements there, but at this, and Buffy does, to give it credit, it does kill off characters, but at the same time, for the most part, most episodes of Buffy you're watching, you are aware that the characters are going to be pretty safe, and as a result, even though it has like horror sort of stylings, it's not, you're not like, you wouldn't put Buffy as like a horror first in the same way that you wouldn't put Legion as like a horror first. But I do think for me it just added like another sort of distinct flavour, and I think it was just a really interesting way to build an antagonist, was to actually go the horror route rather than just have them be your typical like generic. Because again, it could be a really, in many ways, it is a sort of generic evil villain. Like it pretty much is just explained to be this evil entity that's evil because it wants to be really.
It's just evil, 100%.
And so rather than try to go, okay, we're gonna give it, you know, we're going to make it this like really deep character. Instead, they could just go like, no, okay, it's this like cosmic entity that's been living in his mind, but that is actually quite like that would be quite disturbing. Yeah, and obviously the fact that it plays into like, you know, you see David's past when he's younger, and that I thought was really effective. You know, it's always when you kind of go into the perspective of a child, and you know, when the house is always darker and, you know, all creaks are sort of louder. Again, I thought to me did a good job of just like constantly feeling like a bit off, and kind of using like, again, like stuff from your life, you know, like again, just like using like childhood fears and things like that, or even because they have like a bit where you're reading a storybook, don't you? And that whole thing of like taking something that, you know, you knew when you were a kid and sort of flipping it on its head, I thought was quite interesting.
What is it? The book's called, what is it? The World's Angriest Boy in the World or something?
Yes, yeah. So moving on again, in terms of setting, did you have any thoughts or feelings regarding the setting? Like, it's not really important, at least like the show never really addresses it, but did you notice anything in particular about the setting? Did you think it was set in a particular time, or I guess I would say place, but it's very obviously like America.
Yeah. I think this was like a super interesting question actually, and the more I thought about it, it was because I had kind of read your questions while I was watching it, so it was interesting to then go back and watch it while thinking about these things. I think it was like, obviously when you're used to watching TV shows and that now, there is a lot of like, everyone has a phone and everyone has a laptop and stuff like that, and there was like an absolute complete absence of that in this, which I think is good because it didn't date it. And there was obviously technology, but it looked very much like handmade, like cobbled together type thing. I think as well the kind of hospital scenes were giving me very much like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest type vibes, which I looked it up was in the 70s, mid-70s. And I feel like Sid's clothes as well at points felt very 70s as well. Yeah. But then you had, in comparison, other characters like Tormy. He was dressed like something out of like the Great Depression, and he had a Tommy gun, which seemed very odd. Like I think it definitely just kind of added to the weirdness of it. It wasn't defined. It was also nice that it wasn't kind of commented on, and people do have different styles and stuff, but Sid's clothes seemed very 70s, like something that like Twiggy would wear or something. Yeah. And then you had the polar opposite with the other guy, and then the other characters just seemed to be generally like just like their clothing was like bland almost. Do you know what I mean? Like it wasn't set to a specific time or anything like that. So I think, but then you had the character of Oliver who looked very like his clothes were very specific. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. That's not the kind of stuff that maybe you would wear going to the cinema later on.
You never know.
And when he had his little ice cube, and it was like he was playing jazz, and it was very not of this time, but then you could argue that he'd been missing for 20 years, so he was stuck in whatever time it was that he went missing. Yep. But I think it definitely was like a nice little side kind of note almost for the viewers to be like, here you go, you figure that out, or you kind of can decide what's happening there. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. No, it's an interesting one because it wasn't even something I watched it to begin with as it was coming out, and I think I remember after the first episode, maybe it might not even been after the first, maybe after the first few, and I remember it being a discussion point, and it wasn't something I'd really thought about to begin with, and then people were discussing, I remember people talking about the fact that they liked the sort of implaceability of it, but I remember people saying if you were going to pin it to any sort of particular time period, it probably would be, like you say, 70s, and even Clockwork's, Clockwork Orange, 70s film. And yeah, like I like the sort of anachronistic style of it. One thing that's interesting is that the third series introduces time travel, In a
God, like there wasn't enough going on.
Oh well, it's done in a very Legion-y way as well. It's like
Oh God.
not like anything you've ever seen. Which again I absolutely loved about it, because like I said, I think the third series is the one that kind of it lands where it should really, and is doing its own thing. But yeah, it's very Legion-y, and weirdly kind of like visually straightforward, because it's like this girl, and she, like, I think it's visualized a lot by like her walking down this corridor and there's different doors and stuff, so in a sense it's like almost like more accessible, you kind of are aware, but it basically maybe it would maybe be a surprise, but there's something inevitable about the fact that, you know, they eventually bring in his father, and you know so but you do then find out that is like the 40s when he meets his dad, and he's kind of like meeting his mum. So that does, and I don't think they actually state the year, but it is very clearly the 40s at that point, and I think it's very like post World War II. So it is basically confirmed then that it's set in the 70s. And again, I like the fact that they went to the effort of conveying this time period, but don't make a point of like telling you they've done that. Again, I think it adds to the sort of like weirdness to it, but also, again, one of the things I like about it, I think the thing that I like allows me to excuse the weirdness is the fact that they seem to have it all figured out.
Yeah, like I dread to think, can you imagine the writing process? Like, I imagine they just had walls and walls and walls of all the plans and who everyone was, how it all tied up, how everything, every little plot point was brought together. That just sounds like nothing but stress.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think you're probably right, to be honest. But yeah, like I think, yeah, for me it works. But yeah, because they've done the work, but they just don't really. They don't need to tell you what the work is, and they've got a plan. But you know, you get their sort of like, because the way that they want the parts of it they feel are important to convey, and it's more like an emotive thing than they actually like showing it. But yeah, I thought for me, the setting thing was one of the sort of aspects of it in particular that I thought was just really interesting. It could have, again, it's just another thing that distinguishes it from like your average superhero-y thing, is that you just don't really know when it's set. And yeah, like again, it's an interesting way to kind of, there's also a reference to the Muppets. Did I make that up?
Oh, must not have been in season 1, because
No.
I had to caught that.
Big Muppet fan. But yeah, no, fair enough. I guess so the last sort of 2 points I was going to discuss were, obviously if you'd watch more, I'm guessing the answer is no, which is again
correct.
Yeah, very fair. Like I said, it's one of those things, if you like it, then for me I was so with it, and I was like, I want as much of this as there's going to, and I was very happy that they did 3 seasons and then wrapped it up there, because I feel like it's not the sort of thing that would have survived. I mean,
can you imagine if it went down the like a 16 season route? That would just be.
Well, I think it was almost blessed by like the fact that the ratings completely fell off. I think the only reason that they got to finish it is because of how successful Fargo is, and I think, you know, it's the same channel that produced basically Legion and Fargo, and Noah Hawley makes both, and I think. I don't know if ever like there was ever threats or anything, but I think it basically was a case of, you know, let me finish Legion and I'll keep doing Fargo for you. Because I think he didn't, you know, it's not that I don't think he doesn't want to make Fargo, but I think he kind of like was quite happy leaving it after maybe like season 1 or 2, and they wanted him to come back and do 3, and then he took a break after 3, and I think season 4 has now just come out. So I think he's kind of like, you know, he's like, allow me to finish Legion and I'll give you more Fargo. Which I think is a pretty fair trade, especially because Fargo is also really good. So basically, it's not quite. I think one of my favourite things is Toy Story 3. So apparently, you know, there was obviously a huge gap between Toy Story 2 and Toy Story 3. Pixar, Disney were obviously, you know, really, really pushing Pixar to make a Toy Story 3, and they weren't ready to for ages. They hadn't really like figured out what they wanted to do with it. They didn't feel like they were ready to tell that story. And the concession they made was they said they would do a Cars 2 if they were allowed to take their time with Toy Story 3. So that is why.
I love it. And
that's why.
Oh, do you think that's why Cars 2 is not anyone's
Yeah.
favourite.
It's why it's soulless, because they didn't want to do it, and it's also why that was like the next film that came out after Toy Story 3, was because it was
That's
like
amazing.
the price they paid. I don't know if there's a similar thing that happened with Cars 3 and Toy Story 4. I think it was Cars 3 and Incredibles 2 was the other one that happened,
Okay.
because I'm sure the two of them came out like back to back.
How funny. Imagine having that power to be like, no, I'll do this if I can get to do this.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so there's a very like similar to Legion. There's a completely like disconnected reference to end this one on. Obviously next time we'll be back with another conceptual episode, and I'll be hosting it again. But yeah, for this one, Catherine, thank you very much for persevering with Legion. And
No worries. Thank you very much. I do appreciate what they were trying to do, but it was just not. It was just not for me, and now I know that. So
yeah, that's fair. That's fair, and I'm glad it was nice to discuss it. And again, we for the most part we don't really disagree on these things. So I think it was definitely a super interesting show to discuss. And I have found myself recently asking, have you seen Legion? Just so that I can talk to them about it. Like, yeah.
To be like, oh, what was that all about?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely. No, I'm with you there. It's one of those things that, yeah, at least, even if you don't like it, at least you have things to say. I kind of felt like that with like House of Gucci, where I didn't love the movie, but I'm very much like, whenever someone's seen it, I'm like, oh, great, I can talk about it.
Yes.
Yeah, I like appreciate the fact I've seen it, even though I like it was like I didn't really enjoy watching it. But yeah, we'll end the podcast here, and so we'll see you next time. And thank you very much. Farewell.
See you later.